Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Paul VanValin, and we are engaged in a series of webinars. Let me just check my... No, it won't escape. I need to make sure that I'm in the screen. Okay, here we go. I'm Dr. Paul VanValin, and we are in a series, Lead Like the Good Shepherd. This one's called The Psychology and Psychosis of Leadership. I'm real excited about this. It summarizes much of what I do clinically and in terms of coaching with leaders, both from a reparative and a preventative standpoint. The slide of introduction I put up every time. Becky and I are celebrating our 40th anniversary this month, or July actually, and we're excited about that. Next week we're going to go visit our kids. We're all getting together for a family vacation, so we're celebrating life and relationship within our family these days. I am going to be certified in Pro-D comprehensive assessments this month. That is an executive and team assessment, very comprehensive, looking at competencies, mission, and style, and the interface of people. I'm excited about that, so we'll be offering that, and I may chat about that another time. Here's the mission statement for the Institute. We equip leaders to develop healthy families, dynamic communities, and meaningful legacies. And we're fleshing out our website, EdenLeaders.com. We've got links to training, and so that's going to be the place that I'll be putting all of these webinars and things that I write. Working on a booklet, Win Every Argument, Win Every Heart. I hope to have that out in another month. And I feel compelled to start putting some of this content in written format. So we'll see how that goes. The objectives of this activity that you will assess yourself and your ministry or business for healthy versus psychotic leadership elements, which we'll define as we go through. As you look forward, I hope you either have or will develop and sustain healthy behaviors for yourself and the social connectedness to continue to do well until the very end of your career. If you're not in a community of support and accountability, I would encourage you to join one. And as always, I want us to be in the top 10% in every aspect of life. So everything that I do has to do with ideas. And a construct is a term that defines a bunch of ideas that come together to define something, such as love. Love is a construct. And so you have to define these terms, which is why I spent a little time at the beginning of each talk doing this. So I love God, I love my wife, I love hot dogs, I love ice cream. You know, the one word has many different meanings depending on the context. I can do without ice cream and hot dogs, can't do without God and my wife. So we have to define what it means. Some of the constructs we're using in this presentation are self-awareness, other awareness, and God awareness. And a point that I will be developing that I want to make right from the outset is you can't separate them. In David Benner's book, The Gift of Being Yourself, he really eloquently describes how you have to have it all. You have to know yourself, you have to be interfacing and knowing others, and knowing God to have a clear sense of who you are, your identity, and the context in which you function as an individual and as a leader. So awareness of self, awareness of others, and awareness of God. We'll be talking about that. And transference and countertransference are terms that come from my field, psychology, psychiatry, and transference refers to the emotional reactions, therefore the way people perceive you and react to you. Mostly subconscious. They are unaware of why they feel what they feel and why they do what they do. Countertransference is our reaction to them. I, as a leader, how do I perceive someone who may be stirring feelings in me? Maybe they're angry, maybe they're critical, maybe they seem anxious, or maybe they're behaving in inappropriate fashion, and how I interpret what they're doing will affect my behavior. So we want to talk about leading with great self-awareness, other awareness, and God awareness, to not fall into the traps that exist for problems with transference and countertransference. I have a training online just to address those two constructs. We'll be presenting them in context today as well. So let's define leadership. The first definition is really sterile. I am in charge, therefore I'm a leader, therefore what I do is leadership. It has nothing to do with quality. So quality I found this definition: the ability to help people achieve things they don't think are possible. Leaders are coaches with a passion for developing people, not players. They get satisfaction from achieving objectives through others. So there is a mission, and it's very important, but the people are as important as the mission. This is very important in contemporary leadership. I'm reading a book, The End of Leadership, and it's striking. It's a history of leadership and how we moved from totally autocratic, authoritarian to a more democratic kind of leadership. And to deal with millennials in particular, we have to be able to communicate with them in a way that is other than just autocratic. And any list of top tens, and I present this in the very first, Lead Like the Good Shepherd, they're relational. For example, communicate, motivate, delegate. All these things are relational components that are qualities of great contemporary leaders. And there's a lot of literature, mostly in secular literature, to help develop this kind of thing, such as the book Crucial Conversations that I've referred to before. The construct of psychology is essentially the study of the human mind and functions, or a group, or a process. So there are three components to this complex construct, and we have to be mindful of all of them if we're going to talk about the psychology of leadership. So it's knowing the individual, the self, my own psychology, knowing if I'm leading an individual, their psychology, if a group, the psychology of the group, and then the process itself. Pardon me. Psychology is about the ability to predict, to understand and predict. And as a leader, you have to stay one step ahead of those that you are following, hopefully anticipating the next crisis, if at all possible. Or once the next crisis comes, we have the resilience and the wisdom to lead those that are just wandering amok through to success. Psychosis. This term is used in my field as a part of a cluster of symptoms that would define a diagnosis of mental illness. Psychosis itself is not a diagnosis. It is a state of mind and behavior. And it applies very nicely to any of us when we are literally out of our minds. Anytime you have someone saying of someone else, what were they thinking about? What was she thinking? What was he thinking? Or when you find yourself saying, what was I thinking? You have stepped out of your normal, rational, calm, wise mind into some other kind of state, usually emotionally driven, often in a transference, countertransference kind of context. Psychosis is an abnormal condition of the mind that involves a loss of contact with reality. People experiencing psychosis may exhibit personality changes and thought disorder, actual disordered thinking. Depending on its severity, this may be accompanied by unusual or bizarre behavior, as well as difficulty with social interaction and impairment in carrying out daily life. So it's for those of us that do not have an illness, a psychotic state is out of our normal mind, with behavior, thoughts that are incompatible, inconsistent with who we are, what our calling is, and we've become detached from self-awareness, other awareness, and God awareness. We are limiting our focus to some kind of narrow thing, coming to conclusions and behaving in ways that are not good for us, not good for others. And so it can affect thought. My thinking can become out of line, actual behavior and choices, social situations, and you can actually move your institutions into psychotic states. I've seen many churches do this with severe problems when they're making just wild speculative things in terms of building or buying or expanding programs or things like that. Just not reasonable at all. Midlife is a time when it is normal to have at least psychotic thoughts, using the way we're using this term. This is between the ages of 35 and 55, and it's a 20-year span that we are trying to resolve some developmental issues. I think it's normal. I don't think it's an evil thing. I think that some people make big mistakes during this period of life. But the three questions from adolescence, 13 to 25, who am I really? How do I define and see myself in the context of my heritage, my future? That consists of my strengths, my gifts, my weaknesses, my frailties, my calling, which also relates to what will I do with myself? Who am I? Who will love me is another question. Peers, family, maybe a loved one that I would one day marry. Who is that? We're trying to define that in the teenage years. And what will I do with myself in terms of career, avocation, hobbies? What are my passions? How should they be expressed? All this is adolescent development. So we go through the 20s into the 30s, and it's usually a significant loss. Something happens to us that pushes us into a state of assessing, evaluating how life is, and it always comes up a little bit lacking. That's the onset of midlife. In my life, I was 36 years of age. My oldest son intentionally slammed the door closed on his younger brother's fingers. Now, fortunately, it didn't seriously harm. There was a gap there. There was some flexibility of those little fingers. So there was no great injury, but he was appropriately punished. And after that, I sat down and said, I do not have the perfect son. Not only that, I don't have the perfect wife. I don't have the perfect job. I don't live in the perfect house. And the list went on and on until I finally came to, I don't have the perfect God, at least not as I would define him, as I would want him to be. And so being the weird thinker that I am, I said, I've entered into midlife. I'm negatively assessing every aspect of my life, and I have a decision here. I can choose to grieve what I don't have, embrace and love what I do and move forward, or I can go crazy and have a midlife crisis. So I chose the former. I decided I would grieve my losses, my things I may never do. You have a sense of mortality. Life is not going to be forever. So you move out of an optimistic adolescent, young adult state into a midlife state, and there's work to be done to move into the age of wisdom, which begins 55, 60, 65. Becky and I both turned 62 in July, 40 years of marriage. We should be functioning in the age of wisdom, and I think for the most part we are. We are able to give to the next generation useful content examples, our own life-giving stories. That's where you want to be. I mean, we're still developing, but we feel like God has successfully helped us navigate some things to create some fitness for the age of wisdom that we find ourselves in. Now, when you are a founder of an organization, you started your own church, you started your own business, you were young, you were 24 to 30, you had all the vim and vigor. You may hit midlife at the same time as your organization. One of the really sad facts from the 80s, this is old research, it may not be accurate now, but in the late 80s, the average lifespan of a charismatic church, they were differentiating denominational organizational churches from independent, led often by a dynamic leader with a singular vision. So these churches would spring up and then die after 12 years. The average lifespan was 12 years for charismatic startups, looking back from the 70s into the 80s. And I think one of the reasons for that was this phenomenon of midlife. The organization, after 10, 12 years, is experiencing midlife realities. If you bought your first little building, it now is looking shabby after 12 to 15 years. Where's the money going to come from? Your own life is in the same place. You're realizing the work and the labor and the struggle to try to accomplish what you were hoping to accomplish. So the midlife of the individual leader, perhaps the spouse, and the midlife of the organization can come into conflict between 35 and 55, creating double possibility for distractions that can cause cracks in the organization. So we want to resolve this stuff before we hit the age of wisdom. The four tales that I'm going to tell you all have their basis in real people. I'm not necessarily representing an individual, though I will talk in the singular as if it is a particular person. The one is clearly a particular person. You can read about it in the news if you want, the last one, or the third one. And so these are four things that I ask every leader to evaluate, to come to understanding, because these four things are what cause us to react in situations not with a conscious awareness, but from a rather visceral or emotional state, often leading to bad decisions. And very often when we make significant errors, or when we're carrying these things heavily, anger, anxiety, addiction, and isolation, it represents an unfixed brokenness from past generations. I often, when I'm working with someone who has really fallen into some difficult straits, we'll look back and see some generational patterns. So it isn't just us we need to understand. We need to understand where we're coming from, who we are, and where we're going, to have full awareness of self, others, and God. So the anger tale, high D on the disc. And I have a training in the first, Lead Like the Good Shepherd, that refers to the disc. And I have a workbook in the references later if you want to explore this further. But a high D personality is like me, very expressive, prefers brief communications. When he perceives threat, his initial fleshly response is anger and fighting. That's high Ds or hard chargers, sometimes perceived as overly aggressive. So this pastor had a great history of leadership. He was running a great big church. This is a denominational system, so he came into a big church. He grew it further. They were going to look at a building expansion project worth millions of dollars. But that project led to tremendous conflict within the organization and within his leadership team. So he ended up perceiving others as being against him, taking it personally. That's the countertransference piece. He sees people, reacting. And then once he started reacting negatively, that just created this huge whirlwind of anger and resentment and all kinds of emails and everything, big mess. So he came to me about a year before his departure from this organization and said, Paul, do you think I'm an angry person? Now, I already knew about some of these stories, so that's a question like if Becky was to ask me, honey, do you think I look fat in this? There's a no-win scenario here. There's no way to come out of this alive. So I didn't try to answer his question. I did try to direct him to talking about what he was observing, the kind of feedback people were giving him, and encouraging him to at least consider this and look at what am I doing that is promoting this perception that I'm an angry person. He was getting really heavy criticism. Well, a number of months later, just before his departure, he had another meeting with me. And he said, Paul, can you help me be less of an angry person? Now, I kind of knew it was already kind of over here. But I did tell him how if he wanted to devote some concerted time, reduce his stress, take a year, and work on himself, he could come out someone who was much more in tune with his own emotional state, much more able to respond to stress and that sort of thing. But we never had any more meetings because they had him leave. So he lost his position in the church because he lost awareness of himself. He was not self-aware that he was contributing to a very caustic, destructive environment. He created because leaders are responsible, he was responsible for creating a staff that was so demoralized, so unhappy, and a congregation that was as well. And so you step out of self-awareness and other awareness immediately, and you lose sight of your calling. As a leader, his job is not necessarily to pick a battle and win it in the church. The timing, the finances, all that could be worked out, but it became the power struggle that just took him out. And so here's that book, Gift of Being Yourself, Benner and Pennington, that I reference. I have it written down in the last slide. You can look at that as well. Great book. You can't separate knowledge of self, God from others. And when you do, and he essentially writes, we all are wearing a false self until we gather this kind of awareness and become real clear on who we are, which affects everything, our thoughts, our thinking, our behavior. So, and this story also illustrates as stress increases, so does dysfunction unless you know how to manage yourself and your stress. So as the pressure built up, things got worse until the church's conclusion was they needed another leader. And the church is doing great now. They're one of our partner churches. They're doing really great. So the Bible talks about anger. Essentially, it says, watch it, be aware of it. It doesn't condemn it. Ephesians 4:25 through 27, each one speak truth to one another, for we are members of one body. Be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down in your wrath. Don't give the devil a foothold. So there's nothing wrong with anger. Anger has a purpose. It signals that something is wrong. If I'm in a group of people and I yell because I need their attention with an angry kind of holler, everybody looks. And sometimes that's life-saving and life-giving, not necessarily life-destroying. Because it makes us perk up our attention so we become very vigilant, even hyper-vigilant, until we are able to assess that everything's fine. It affects mood. Over time, if we remain angry, appetite, sleep are affected, and then eventually relationships as well. So while it gives us energy to solve problems and fight battles, it's an energizing emotion. If we keep too elevated with that state, it creates actual toxins in our brain, cortisols that are actually destructive of what takes place in our brain. So it energizes the epinephrine system, the adrenal system, high energy, greater strength physically and sometimes mentally as it pertains to a conflict, but not mentally as it pertains to the big picture. So you've all probably heard something about the type A personality studies from the 70s and 80s. I participated in some of that years ago. People that carry this, real effective leaders who carry this angry kind of core, much more prone to heart attack as these toxins do their business on our brain and neurobiology and ultimately the organ of our heart. So the rational versus emotional brain are also constructs that I refer to a lot. And the calm brain is necessary for self-control, problem solving, and creative thinking, represented by the high level of activity in the prefrontal lobe, right behind the eyes. The limbic system, or the part of the brain that manages emotions, is activated as emotions pick up to the point of overriding the prefrontal lobe. Now, the way anger and fear both work effectively is there's an alarm that goes off in the brain. We're ready for action. The prefrontal lobe assesses, is there danger, gives the all clear signal, and we calm down. Our own thoughts can keep and override over the all clear signal to where we feel like we're in danger. We feel like we're in the presence of an enemy when really we're okay. And the whole transference countertransference system feeds that. So anger and fear or anxiety or lust all can change our rational brain into an emotional brain, changing the way we think, what we do, the way we say things, the perception of things. And they all translate ultimately into a selfish brain where we are detached from others, detached from God, detached from our real true self, and then focused on this one thing, this either problem or desire that has become all-encompassing. It's not a great place to stay. And if we isolate, we're at greater risk for living in this place. So that's tail one. Anger has its place. When it's overused, it becomes problematic for everybody, even the person who is angry. Anxiety. So anger is first, anxiety is second. Fear of failure is what this was about. We have a pastor who has been engaged in ministry for a number of years, marriage for a number of years. Some things not going well at all in his marriage, some things not going well at all in the church. This is a pastor story. And he doesn't know it, but he actually has developed a condition that is treatable that relates to depression and anxiety, but he's not consciously aware of that. He just knows he doesn't feel well, he's having a tough time. And here's where this countertransference comes in. He begins getting positive messages from a woman in his church, and he responds to them. It feels good. He's getting attention, concentration. What he's absolutely unaware of, and so this is, he's losing awareness of other, is that what drives her is her own brokenness. And her need for him is meeting some kind of broken thing from her own marriage, her own background, her own relationship with her father, unresolved love issues someplace in the past. So this pastor just takes it at face value. Hey, she likes me. I like her. This is fun. This feels good. And he engages in an appropriate relationship. It comes out. It splits the church. And I wouldn't know these stories unless they're people that came to see me. So they all get help. They all do better. But there is a cost for giving in to your anger or your anxiety or the things we talk about. So people are lost from the local church at least. Or if it's a business, you lose valuable employees and you lose the capacity to move forward with your mission. Sometimes they are never recoverable. And in the case of adultery, the relationship that you had with the other adulterer, you have to lose that. That has to be done, and no contact evermore, ever after that. And if you're working on saving your marriage, saving your position, saving your organization, you have to step away from those things that have caused destruction. So anxiety. Be anxious for nothing, but with everything, with thanksgiving. In everything with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Thanksgiving is incompatible with anxiety. Philippians 4 is the most quoted chapter in all of my work as a coach, as a consultant, as a counselor. Philippians 4 is rich in defining what to do about anxiety. Verse 9 is what to think about, whatever is pure, lovely, worthy of praise, excellence. Paul was a great cognitive therapist. What we think about affects what we feel. And so our faith, our belief structure can come into play to help us with our fears, with our anger, with our addictions, if we will energize it and get it going. So you'll see the next 4 bullets are exactly the same as for anger. If you flip back to this, something is signaled. So when someone is afraid, we all look, and all feelings are a little bit contagious. What are they afraid of? We start looking around. Is it them? Is it this? And if it keeps up long enough, it becomes hypervigilant and eventually has the same kind of negative neurotoxicity as anger does. And it can be managed. Anger can be managed through learning about oneself, learning how to understand one's stresses, learning to calm down. Very similar methods with anxiety. The individual that I'm choosing to talk about needed some medication to bridge through. Didn't need it forever, but he needed a little antidepressant medication to help calm his brain's activity, get a little bit undepressed, get some energy going in a positive direction. But through coaching, consulting, doing well. Every time there's a a loss, you actually feel that for the rest of your life. You grieve, you touch into that. But God can move us forward in really dramatic ways, and our worst stories become our best stories in the end. So when we're thinking of stress, if you've been watching this series, you've seen this before. In my right hand is my resilience ball, all of my energies to draw from: psychological, social, spiritual, relational, physical. And I need to keep a good amount of this going. And whatever size resilience ball you've got is all you get. It's sort of a law of physics thing. Mine's pretty big. I come from a pretty energized bunch of people. And over here in my left hand, there's this bowl, and it's got a little spigot on it. It's my stress bowl. And every stressor either drips or pours or floods into this bowl, and it can only contain so much. So it represents a finite capacity to deal with stress and a finite amount of resources to cope with life. And so stressed out is when I've still got some energy going over here, but this is overflowing to the point that my weakness in character, physical, all these systems, psychosocial, spiritual, relational, the cracks in the system show up. And I have to be able to, turn that spigot and drain it out. And burnout then is when not only is my stress bowl overflowing, but my resilience ball is just gone. And then that requires greater repair. Almost always symptoms of depression, apathy, become very self-protective, very pulled in. Isolation occurs during burnout, usually requiring 3 to 6 months of repair. Whereas stressed out, maybe I just need a Sabbath. Maybe I just need a day of relaxing, watch a little TV, do a little reading, spend some time in prayer, talk with my spouse, so we get this, keep this ball going and drain some off. For many of us, the same thing that energizes us also reduces our stress. If you're a high D personality, if I run, I get both. Both are affected by that. It burns off some of the anxiety, anger, energy that I've got, and it just pours off some of that stress. So we all have to figure out, how do we drain this? We all have to keep a Sabbath, and hardly anybody does in my world. My Sabbath typically is from Friday evening to noon Saturday. That's my typical Sabbath. It's not Sunday. I'm working on Sunday. I'm counseling people, praying with people. And for pastors, this is really important, that you have a day where you're not doing counseling, you're not doing sermon writing, unless it just super energizes you, but it's really work. You can be reading things and so forth, but you need to have some physical activity, you need to have some social activity, you need to spend time with family. It needs to be away from work. That's a Sabbath, focusing on the good things God gave us and who He is Himself. So time of prayer, spiritual reflection, meditation, reading, but not work. And so these are the constructs that are always involved in the crack-ups that I talk about a lot. And the stresses can come in from 4 general areas. I'm focusing on clergy here. There's a big body of research on clergy stress that I cite at the end. Some of the same principles apply to any leader, and that the 4 areas are the same. They get played out a little differently because of the public nature of the work of the clergy compared to the CEO of an enterprise. But they come from within. Intrapersonal means it's in me. My biology. I have a slight curvature of the spine. I have a tendency toward anxious perfectionist kinds of thinking. That's me. I have to manage that, because that doesn't come from anywhere else. That is triggered by stuff. So I have to know me. Family marital stressors. The pressure on a pastor's family is really quite intense. The kids are supposed to behave. The wife is supposed to do this and that. There are all these supposed tos. Unrealistic expectations and role ambiguity create great stress for pastors. I see couples who lead together in business, similar kinds of things, expectations of each other. People will fall into blaming and criticism, and so that the marriage and the organization stresses get mingled in when we co-lead together. People can be really unhappy with you, those that follow you. And the countertransference and transference thing I'm putting under social stressors. People may be inappropriately expressing anger or love or admiration, and we can't get sucked into it. We have to view it for what it is. And as you get to know people with really good people assessment methods, you can stay abreast of this, particularly, but only if actually you also share your ideas and observations with someone else, and they can help you get out of your countertransference stuff, because the definition of countertransference are things you don't know, you can't see, which requires you to see somebody else. In psychoanalysis, early on, they realized this. So you can't do psychoanalysis without being in analysis. The assumption is if you work alone in psychoanalysis, you will hurt people as you try to work out your problems with them. This happens all the time in leadership. We read all the time about corporate leaders who did this or did that. Nokia just had a weeping corporate leader expressing how they failed the company. They just did what they knew how to do. They didn't adapt. All kinds of things where we fail to be fully aware of who we are, what our constituency is, and for those of us who are believers, who God is. That's all part of the equation. Vocational stressors. I don't know anybody, honestly, who is actively engaged in a dynamic ministry who doesn't feel financial pinch, or any entrepreneur for that matter. If you're living on the edge, living the great adventure, there's sometimes money becomes stressful, and there's constant stress because stress is about adaptation. So the four areas that we need to be working on for balance have to do with what's in us, what's in our marriage and family, what's in our organization, and then just the very nature of the job itself. Clarity as to mission and method. So here's my addiction tale, and this is current. This is in the news today. We had in my community, and it's public knowledge. That's why I'm just freely documenting this. I'm not breaking confidence. But a number of years ago, it was in the news also that a very successful youth director, dynamic, athletic, kind of the classic leader person, had inappropriately engaged an 18-year-old babysitter, and it came out very quickly, and there was a public confession, and he acknowledged inappropriately touching her, without a lot of specifics. But the implication was it was a non-invasive sexual encounter. Well, he did a year of hard work, was never able to engage in ministry. The family suffered a lot because of the kids were in Christian school. They put restrictions on his access to the property, just a whole lot of stuff going on that was really, really challenging for a number of years. But in spite of that, the family were doing pretty well. He was doing pretty well, had established a new career, was permitted a ministry with adult men, really a very effective, kind of guy. But then a little over a year ago, I think it was, this young woman who now is, in her 30s, came forward with a formal complaint, and the complaint was more severe than what she and her family had allowed to be public record 15 years ago. So the big question is this even true? Some of the stuff that's coming out. We know he confesses some specific things, which are bad enough, but what he's been charged with would put him away into prison for life. And today he was convicted. He was found guilty, and his sentencing will be fairly soon. So this is a tragic, tragic tale of someone who did not gain control of his impulses. And I don't know all of his history, but I know that there was some history that preceded this, where lines were crossed. And so I've put him in the addiction category because addictions cause us to function in ways that we would not function because of a drivenness, a compulsion. We have to do it. It becomes irresistible. And so this is a real tragic tale of someone who didn't learn to manage his impulses. And addiction, the current theory of addiction is that its seeds are planted between the ages of 7 and 10. So this is a cautionary tale, not just for adult leaders, but for parents and for leaders of parents. We don't really pay good attention to how our 7 to 10-year-olds are developing. There are very cautious parents who try to not get them to not be exposed to media and so forth, so they don't have the kind of exposure that's possible. It's possible at the age of 4 or 5 to maneuver a device and see pornographic images. I mean, exposure to media is almost unlimited as soon as you can push a button. So it is, so just from a parenting standpoint, to actually be very careful. But that's just a part of it. The other part is that kids in our culture don't get enough time, attention, and touch. Those are my 3 buzzwords: parental time, not just time, but really attending to them in a way that's meaningful interaction, and then appropriate physical touch. And so young boys end up eroticizing their needs for contact. And so all these things come together. Usually it's a child in difficult straits who discovers something, difficult circumstance, stress, discovers something that makes them feel better, right? Could be little bits of alcohol left in a party environment. They get to taste that. Could be exposure to pornography online. Could be that they're misused by a babysitter. They're sexually abused themselves, but it has a pleasurable component. All kinds of stories occur where they begin seeking the same kind of satisfaction in that activity through their teenage years. And so you have the developing teenage brain, the adolescent brain, going through all of these powerful emotional changes, all these hormonal changes, all these growth development changes. And in the midst of that are these addictive practices, just getting wired into the brain, into the behavior, into the expectations, and into the definition of self, and into life itself. This is what brings life joy and satisfaction, is the addiction. So then you go from the adolescent brain, which goes all the way to 25 or so. And in those years, when in America they're in college, they're in the military, they are highly likely to engage in activities that are not necessarily healthy spiritually, emotionally, relationally, physically. But it is the precursor, it's the beginning of the wiring of the adult brain, which then is a little harder to change. There's more plasticity up until 25, 26, 27, 28, when the adult brain starts forming. Now, there still is opportunity for growth and development. We can still get people out of their addictive brain, out of their anxious brain, out of their angry brain, out of their depressed brain. But it's just harder. It's just more work. And there's almost always more damage that's been done. So one of my soapboxes I get up on and preach about is, let's really pay attention to how our 7 and 10-year-olds are doing. How are they doing socially? How are they feeling about themselves? What are they learning about life and love and God and calling and purpose? We put a lot of emphasis on teenagers, and I'm telling you, it's too late. We do all this purity stuff with teenagers and all that, and it's, I'm not saying that's bad, but I'd like to see stuff going on with the second graders and the 7 to 10-year-olds. So that's that little side speech. So what happens is these pathways in the brain are developing, and they become constant. And so there's a real compulsion, and it's not just spiritual. It's not just weak-willed. It's as biological a drive as hunger or thirst when it becomes severe. And so what happens is you have this addictive cycle of shameful activity, and I'm feeling shame. I do this thing to get out of shame. It creates more shame. So there's this addictive cycle. We have Proverbs 26, as a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool to its folly. So that's a little reference there that would parallel this sort of thing. When we are pursuing our addiction, it alters our perceptions, thoughts, behaviors, and judgments. We rationalize it. Nobody's really hurt. I'll never get caught. Stuff like this. Really bad. That's denial. And denial is the ultimate lack of awareness of self, others, and God. It's as if they don't even exist in the moment. If we are a Christian leader engaging in bad behavior, it's as if we're not a Christian leader. We are denying our own identity. So that really is a mess. Romans 1 talks about how God observed man engaging in behavior that was not good for him, not consistent with his plan. And actually, I'm kind of reading the Bible front to back. All the first chapters of the Old Testament have story after story after story where people turned away from God. They fell back into the bad habits of their forefathers. So God gave them over to the lust of their desires in Romans 1. Those are our addictions. All the things of the flesh, anger outbursts, drunken orgies, all can pertain to addictions. And we know that the good that we don't want to do, and the bad that the good that we want to do, we end up not doing enough of. The bad that we don't want to do, we end up doing too much of, as Paul wrote about in Romans 7. Now, I don't know if he was dealing with an addiction, but that concept certainly applies to grown Christian leaders who still find themselves tempted to fall back. It's just present. The spirit and the flesh are at odds with each other. It's not just a spiritual problem. It is also a problem of the flesh. It's a problem in relationship. Addictions are multi-determined. But addictions also respond to extensive treatment, but it's a constant vigilance that has to be present. That's why you hear about AA meetings. Hi, I'm Paul. I'm an alcoholic. It's, even though if I've been sober for 30 years, I never let go of the fact that I'm a sinner saved by grace, and I can fall back into that. And so gracious discipleship is required. Non-judgmental leaders who can come alongside and guide people out of addiction. It is judgment and condemnation that causes people to hide. You are a lesser person because you've done such and such. There's a real shameful component to confessing and coming out of addiction that we need to help lead people out of. And if we are engaging in that ourselves, we need that kind of guidance. Can't isolate, which is my next piece. Isolation. So isolation is what it is. It's not sharing with others. It's not engaging others. And so I have a case that I'm sharing that I have a number of cases like this. The pastor blames his wife for all of the church problems. It's her way she's managing people. People are uncomfortable with her. I'm hearing these complaints about her. And this goes on from his perspective, not necessarily his bishop's perspective or his wife's perspective, but he's got this set in his head, and he won't listen to anybody. Stops communicating with the people that he has in their organization. They have bishops who oversee from a spiritual mentor accountability perspective, and he just stops listening to them. They're wrong. It's me and God, and this is a really dangerous place to be in. It's just me and God, and he actually had convinced himself and said to me, you know what? I'll divorce her. I'll be an eligible bachelor. People will come to my church. Women will come to my church because I'm an eligible bachelor. I'll eventually marry. We're going to do great. God's going to bless our ministry. This isn't going to be a problem. You should be sitting in your chair going, that's a load of something as you're listening to me talk, because that's how everybody reacts except for him. And unfortunately, he followed through with this. He's filing for divorce, and this is a family tradition of broken vows. There is in his background broken vows as pertain to marriage and ministry and mission. So this kind of brokenness will continue because we are not fully aware of those things that are driving us, which lead us extremely vulnerable. So isolation, getting into a place. I happen to tell a tale that ends in divorce, but even if not that, just the anxieties we feel, the angers that we feel, and the futility that settles in when we are not connected with other people. And the Bible warns against this. Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. So in the story I just told, there are many advisors. There are several bishops, and then they brought me in, and they brought another pastor of relationship in, and but he would listen to none of us. So his plans will eventually not succeed. There will be failure in his organization. Whoever heeds life-giving correction will be at home among the wise. And actually, if you hang out with the wise, they're going to give you correction. So it implies that you are hanging out with people that can really help you with your perspective, with processing your emotions, who have life-giving stories, even will share their own worst stories to give hope and a different outcome than what you might anticipate. Do not be wise in your own eyes. And anytime I hear leaders say, my board doesn't agree with this, but God's telling me to do this, they're getting wise in their own eyes. And I begin to doubt that they're really hearing from God. My wife thinks this, all of my friends think this, but God's telling me this. And because my assumption is if God can talk to one, he can talk to 2, 3, 4. And that if given the right information, any board can come alongside their leader. I've just seen too many organizations where the leader pushes an agenda, and it's his or her agenda, and they lose big chunks of support as they're functioning in a state of mental isolation. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. It's a great metaphor. The lioness in the savannah is hiding in the tall grass and waiting for that lone little zebra, either young, isolated, or crippled. So they're slow and they're far enough away from the herd. If you're with the herd, you're relatively safe. See, that's the value of being connected. If you're with the herd, the lion's not going to go after you. You're going to go after this other one over here. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. This comes from Ecclesiastes 4. There's I call it a farm, but there's a man working in a field. He falls, no one can help him. But if 2 are working in the field, they can help each other up, better return for their labor, defend against a common enemy, keep each other warm at night if they're off in a cold field someplace. So a cord of 3 strands, and I take this very literally, 3 co-laborers. Do you have 3 co-laborers that you can go to as your council of advisors? Many counselors, there is success. So I say 3 is a minimum. I use this metaphor with a leader, a three-legged stool. We're sitting on a three-legged stool. You take one of those legs away, boop, you fall over. You have to have at least three. Four is even more stable if you can pull that off. And so I think we need to have a council, and it may be numbers of councils. You know, if you're involved in business, you need a council. If you're involved in ministry, you need a council. Marriage, parenting. If you have other hobbies and things that you do, council. We're working together on this. We are teams moving towards success, not individuals. So this is very, very important. And if you have a cord of three strands, you can still isolate by choosing to not be transparent, by choosing to not reveal those things that are going on in your heart and mind. And very often, as soon as we have an idea, we know somebody else isn't going to think it's a good idea. We just keep it to ourselves and we kind of go along. But really, really powerful teams share everything. They risk criticism. They risk having their ideas rejected. And a really good team doesn't reject the person, but some ideas just are bad ideas and they need to be rejected. So concluding statements. If we know who we are, we know our role, we will therefore know those around us, because we can't function in our role effectively without knowing others. You cannot delegate, you cannot cast vision, you cannot motivate without knowing the people that you're leading. And then the call is real critical. I heard a really good message this week. One of the points was Satan doesn't need to set up obstacles. He just has to make a real clear path to the wrong goal. And he did what I'm going to do. Let me repeat this. Satan doesn't need to set up obstacles. He just needs to set a very clear path to the wrong goal. If we're on the right path, we will have obstacles. We will have struggles. That doesn't mean we're on the wrong path necessarily. As long as our council of advisors is advising us, yes, let's keep going. We're in this together. We're doing this together. If you find yourself alone on a path heading toward a goal, whether there are obstacles or not, you need to double check and get your team along with you, or join them in what God is actually doing. What is God doing in the moment? Blackaby's study years ago was great with that question. I want to join God in what He's doing. So we connect with a healthy community of leaders, and we stay connected. I can name a dozen people that God has blessed me with that I can call in the middle of the night. And they will respond, and they will talk with, give advice, and pray. And some of them, they're my core advisors in particular areas. If I have a question, I go to them, I state my question. I just do what they say because they're good at what they do. This is real important. And one of the reasons we have this training that we have is to provide for those of you that are more remotely isolated, either because of distance, culture, economics, or whatever, the opportunity to network. And you're always welcome to reach out to me. You have my email. Many of you have my phone number. I'm happy to give it to leaders. You can communicate directly to me, and I'll be happy to be whatever assistance I'm able to be. So we increase self, other, and God awareness, and that involves learning about this transference, countertransference thing. Not that you can ever reach the place where you are totally transparent to yourself. That's why we have to have others with us. But you can begin, feeling a feeling and saying, okay, I know where that's coming from. I'm not going that direction. That can become the kind of awareness you get. So this last phrase I have here, 3 others shape and validate you. As you define yourself, always be engaging your counsel so that you end up with who you really are in a way that's really effective. And some things, these are specific questions you could take to process by yourself, then bring your spouse in, and then bring your counsel in. What are my personality strengths and weaknesses? How am I wired? What is the combination of my DNA, what I've learned in life that is really strong and really weak? I can tell you, I'm sometimes impulsive. I sometimes will get in such a little tunnel of awareness, I exclude other people's realities. I mean, these are things I know about me. And so I need other people where I can say, okay, am I engaging this group well enough? Are we all on board? Because they're better at seeing this than me, so we work together. What are my strengths and weaknesses as a leader? I'm a strong visionary. I'm a mediocre administrator. So I have to have strong administration behind me. How do people perceive me? I learned when I was young that I can be rather serious, and people find that a little scary. So I could appear intimidating by nature of just really being an internal processor. So I learned to smile more. I learned to throw things out there more, and people are more comfortable. You need to know how people perceive you when you're calm and when you're stressed. There's often 2 very different beings. What do I have to do to be at my best? Again, we're talking socially, economically, in ministry, in business, relationally, all the various roles of relationship. What do I need to do to be at my best? And then the question on the call, what does God want from me now? Where is he sending us now? What do I need to develop now? I think you have to have your counsel in on that, or else you're just maybe wasting a lot of time. And so the last question, you just need to be able to name your mentors, coaches, counselors, and counsel. That's all. So this is a little exercise you can engage in, share with your spouse, share with your your counsel, and just so it's clear, and that you know where to go, you know who to talk to, and you grow in these kind of concepts. I'm going to close with a quote by Howard E. Gardner. Before I do that, let me just double check and see if we have any questions coming in. I'm not able to see this. Okay. You can always send a chat question in. Mirabella will give me a little text if something comes in. I'm always happy to answer questions. And even now as I'm wrapping up, if you want me to, we have a few minutes. If you want me to elaborate on anything or touch back, shoot a little chat out there. So Howard E. Gardner, he wrote a book, Leading Minds, The Anatomy of Leadership. I read this decades ago, really long time ago. And it really spoke to me in two levels. He starts out by saying, leadership is lonely. And he elaborates that a little bit. And that resonated with me. I know it's really possible, the Harry S. Truman, President of the United States, had a sign, the buck stops here. I mean, it does, you're the leader. But you don't need to be isolated in that loneliness. In fact, that will help reduce your loneliness. And then he went on to tell stories. His book is about stories. Jesus, Gandhi, Buddha, Eleanor Roosevelt, different centuries, different walks of life, politics, science. And what it did for me was it helped me realize, okay, there's different ways of leading. And I knew I was sort of leading intellectually. So being a teacher, being a leader in that way. And it just helped me frame some things. And this quote I really like. It is important for leaders to know their stories, to get them straight, to communicate them effectively, particularly to those who are in the thrall of rival stories. And above all, to embody in their lives the stories that they tell. And so, if I know my story and I know when it's appropriate to reveal it, then my story can be transformational. And I can be functioning in my leadership with authenticity. I don't look fake. I look very real. And the rival stories can be an employee who thinks we should be doing this. Our mission is this, but they think we should be doing this. Or it could be, if you're a pastor, lay leaders. Pastor, you really should be doing this. Well, you might need to lead them through your story, through the way you lead, so that everybody's on the same path. And of course, when we're dealing from a Christian standpoint, dealing with people who don't know God the way we do, you have different perspectives that you're dealing with. It takes a real gracious, non-judgmental person to be able to communicate accurately who we are, how we function, why we do what we do, and the value of joining us in our story. So these are all things that can be dealt with. I just thought it was a great quote. And you could put pastors in here. It is important I'm going to reread it with pastors in there. It is important for pastors to know their stories, to get them straight, to communicate them effectively, particularly to those who are in the thrall of a rival story, could be from within or without of the church. And above all, pastors embody in their lives the stories that they tell. So they're authentic. So that's a great quote from Gardner, and this doesn't want to change. My last slide is... we have our website up, and I'm now, you can still reach me at VanValin at Eden Counseling. That's still live, but I'm putting up Paul at Eden Leaders. We're really trying to get that branding out there. And leaders can call me. That's perfectly acceptable. I've never had to block a leader from calling me. But if someone was a nuisance, they'd get blocked out. I failed to fix this slide. I presented this at a conference. You can ignore the second one. We have ongoing Thursday webinars. We'll be announcing July's. We'll be moving forward with this. The Clergy initiative at divinity.duke.edu is rich with pastoral research and suggestions on how to live a prosperous, a joyous, a meaningful life as a pastor. I highly recommend that site. The next resource is by Brown and Vogus, Understanding How Others Misunderstand You. It's a workbook. You can get it from Amazon.com. And so you take a little test, you find out where you are on the disc, gives you great examples of usage. And the fun thing I like is it takes biblical characters and they assume they know what their personalities are. And that's kind of a fun part of that book. So they're Christian authors, and I think Christian leaders really benefit from working through this. The Gift of Being Yourself, David Benner, one of my favorite authors. Short, meaningful. I have to read him 3 times. I referenced that book. Flourish is a secular author, Martin Seligman. You've heard me reference this before. He is scientifically approaching happiness and well-being. He counsels nations. And I think it is a rich, rich book for leaders to read. Leading Minds, most of you have never heard of. It was good for me, so I share that with you as well. So what have we done today? We have gone through defining psychosis and psychology of leadership, given some cautionary tales, talked about some things that you can and, in my opinion, should do to stay sane and functional. And don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to hire a coach, hire a counselor. In our culture, that is considered wise. That isn't a shameful thing. Some of us are still sort of stuck in old views that, me and God should be able to manage this. My faith should result in perfect health and success. I'll be just rather blunt. That's all nonsense. That doesn't hold up biblically. It doesn't hold up in terms of practical application. We all need a team. And so if someone like me can come alongside you for a season and become part of that core to 3 strands for a season, then reach out. I have a team of people both who provide clinical services in the counseling center and coaching services in the Leaders Institute. Reach out. If you could use some help developing your team, we have assessment tools and coaching devices. Are very, very effective. We've done some really remarkable stories of helping people work through real, potentially destructive conundrums. And then we run our intensive program down here. So if you need to get out of town and come join our team for a few days, reach out to us. Let us help you. So we've reached the end of our time. Let me just double check and see if we have any comments or questions coming in. Don't have any. Thank you all for joining us. Let me just see who's come in here today. You all have been faithful with attending these things. I'm really grateful for that. I hope you have a great day. I hope your experience as a leader is enjoyable enough to keep going, frustrating enough to learn some things, and that you have a clear sense of who you are leading, and where you are leading them to under the guidance of God Almighty. Take care. Bye-bye. This will be placed online real shortly on our website.